Bom, bom dia, good morning. Nós vamos fazer essas apresentações em inglês para permitir que haja diálogo com os colegas convidados, tá? Mas acho que os slides ajudam quem eventualmente precisar, então acho que não vai ser um problema. Então, the EA is a key place in our university for interdisciplinary interaction. So it's a perfect place to bring together our colleagues from the Primate Archaeology Research Project and our Brazilian archaeologist colleagues, especially since we will talk about capuchin monkeys archaeology, which has been done mostly so far in a very special place for human archaeology in South America, the Serra da Capivara National Park. So, it's not our main focus today, but most definitions of culture by the humanities are still very close to Tyler's classical definition, being something acquired by man was a central part of the definition itself. The evolutionary nature of culture will be the target of another workshop later on, but it's important to notice that to-use was a key part of this traditional view, being once conceived, like the words of Kenneth Oatley, man the tool maker. It was conceived as a defining human trait, with the growing reliance on technology being seen as a key selective pressure behind the evolution of human intellect. Nowadays, we know that tool use is widespread in the animal kingdom, not only among vertebrates, and ranging from simple, species-typical innate behaviors to complex techniques that may vary between populations due to socially biased learning that may give rise to distinct technological traditions. This paradigm change started with the discovery of the spontaneous use of tools by wild populations of chimpanzees. Through long-term field work, this research, beyond individual dexterity, it revealed interpopulational variation that apparently could not be explained by genetic differences or by different environmental affordances alone. Then, in 2002, Mercader and colleagues published a report on what could have been mistaken by a hominin archaeological site, but was actually an ancient accumulation of chimpanzee tools in a nut-cracking site. And this inspired the Primate project, Primate Archaeology, originally under the coordination of Michael Haslam and based in Oxford, UK, aiming to apply archaeological techniques to the search of ancient no-human primate tools. Some forms of non-human primates tool use, such as the use of stick probe tools by orangutans, chimps, also capuchin monkeys, will hardly leave long-lasting remains, but we currently know populations from 3 species, or genuses in the case of capuchins, that customarily use percussive lithic tools, chimps, tufted capuchins, and more recently, long-tailed macaques from the Thai coast. An interesting counterpart of this convergence was another parallel project on the evolution of human percussive technology, in which final meeting I had the pleasure to take part. When you have more sophisticated technology, say from Odo van Arm, I guess, hominin tool making becomes clearly distinct. But to gain insights on early hominin technology, it's useful to have a broader perspective on other primates' lithic technology. In that meeting, where we had the first reports of a study which pushed the record on hominin tool use back to 3.3 million years ago. It all includes Adrian here. And the primate archaeology thrived, and the most fascinating new outcomes so far come exactly from the tufted capuchin monkey studies, which go along with the new generation of primate archaeologists here today. I will skip the spoilers, because our guests are talking about it. But A key point of this workshop here is that to make things more interesting and or more problematic, depending on your take on that, Serra da Capivara, where most of the tufted capuchin archaeology has been conducted so far, is also one of the most important human archaeological sites in South America. And we have counted with a lot of support of the archaeologists of Fundam, which has had a key role in the conservation of this amazing natural park. So, in the spirit of promoting productive interaction and dialogue among these so closely related disciplines in practice, but which are bound to face some of the difficulties we currently find when trying to integrate natural sciences and humanities in the broader issue of cultural evolution. I'm putting all those people together. So, Tiago Falótico, now from EASH USP, will talk about the use of tools by non-human primates, especially on the recent work on capuchins and also a bit about the Macaca fascicularis early work. Thomas Profit from the Institute of Archaeology from University College London will present an overview of the state-of-the-art of primate archaeology and its relevance for our understanding of hominin lithic tool use. Then in the afternoon, Adrián Arroyo from the Instituto Catalán de Paleoecologia Humana in Spain will talk about the current research on the analysis of percussive tools from the early Stone Age, which is the African Lower Paleolithic, and how they can be compared to non-human primates' percussive tools. Then Mercedes Okumura from the Institute of Biosciences of USP will discuss the differences and potential similarities between human and capuchin lithic tools from Serra da Capivara, and how to integrate these studies in a multidisciplinary perspective. And last but not least, Astolfo Araújo from USP Archaeology and Ethnology Museum, MAI, will discuss the current convergences and divergences between archaeology, stricto sensu, and primate archaeology, and to the broader issues related to the ethological approach to culture as a broader evolutionary process. So, we have a couple of minutes if you get straight to schedule, but Tiago can.
So, obrigado a todos por comparecerem aqui. So, thank you everyone for being here and be part of this workshop. So, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the work with non-human primates and to use on non-human primates, and I'm going to give some examples of the work with the chimpanzees, capuchin monkeys, and how what you can learn about the to use in this non-human primates, and what this can contribute to understand the evolution of the to use. So. I have my slides in Portuguese, but I'm going to give my speech in English. So I hope this can be a compromise between. So to use, Edu already talk a little bit about the definition. So we can have them to using a variety of organisms from invertebrates like octopus, spiders, birds, and mammals like dolphins and rodents. But we have the especially interesting in primates. So what's the difference between primates and most of the other taxa? Is that primates have a very diverse tool-use kit, and they use several objects as tools, including rocks, wood, leaves, and they use sometimes the same objects for different functions. We are interested mostly in lithic material and lithic tool use because it's also the most old kind of tools that we can study in the human lineage. So I'm going to mostly talk about the lithic tool use in the primates. And as Edu already said, we have only actually 4 groups that use stone tools. 3 of them are the non-human primates and humans. So we have the captive monkeys. Have the captive monkeys here in South America and now Central America too. And we have the chimpanzees from the West Africa and the macaque. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work done by primate archaeology approach in those primates, and start with the chimpanzees. So the chimpanzees, actually the groups that use lithic tools are from the population from the West Africa. And they use the stone tools mostly as a hammer and anvil for nut cracking of some genus of plants like panda nuts, cola nuts, and Elaeas guineensis, that is the palm nuts. And they mostly use for the stones to crack open nuts. And so that was one of the first description of to use, or at least I think it was the first wild non-human primates to use, described, one of the first of stone to use. And we have just the populations in West Africa using this kind of stone to use. Although this is very interesting, you have a lot of other tool used by chimpanzees in several other populations in Central and East Africa. And that's it's very variable. Even between neighboring groups, you have different kinds of tool use and stone to use. And we can work with so studying the behavior of the chimpanzees using stone tools, we can learn about the formation of sites, like in this example, where Lydia Lunks and Tom Profti and other colleagues studied the transport and then accumulation of tools in the Thai National Park. So we're studying the current behavior, because this is a behavior that the monkeys, the chimpanzees are still presenting. They could understand how the accumulation and the transport of those stone tools happen in that groups, in some groups of the chimpanzees, and understand how the site formation happens. So this is an example of a study of an extant non-human primate, helping to understand the use of stone tool. And of course, you have the archaeology of the chimpanzee archaeology. Like Edu said, the work of Mercader initially studied a stone tool site produced by chimpanzees. And they have 4,000 years old. So it was the first non-human primate archaeology done, and they use the useware of the stone tools used to identify the stone, the material, and use the archaeology methods to understand how the stone tool to identify this stone tool by chimpanzees. Of course. And then we had there was a new study revisiting the same material that I'm going to leave for, I think, Adrian, or maybe Tom is going to talk a little bit about that. He's the first author. And also, beyond the archaeology method, we can also use the primatology to understand how different cultures and in the use of stones by chimpanzees. That's something that with the archaeology method you cannot understand, but because the chimpanzees and the other primates are still doing the behavior, there is some things that we can only understand with the living primate, like identifying the different variants in the stone to use between neighboring groups, like done by Lunks and colleagues. They identify some different to use in neighboring groups of chimpanzees, showing that there can be a very subtle differences even between neighboring groups that use different sizes of stones and different materials to process the same resource. And this is a contribution of the primatology and something that we can only understand studying living primates. Another example, the other non-human primates that use stone tools is the long-tailed macaque. It's Macaca fascicularis aurea. This primate lives in the coast of Thailand and Burma. And they use the stone tools to process, to obtain mollusks, so gastropods and oysters and crab, and detach those food from the rocks, from the rocks where they are attached. And they also use it to break the crabs and these oysters and the shell of those food resources. And they can also use to crack open some fruits like sea almond. So they have a very diverse use of stones, and they use different stones and different parts of the stone depending on the food they are processing. So they can use the point of the stones to detach the gastropods and the oysters. But they're going to use larger stones and the flat part of the stone to crack open the nuts and the food. And each kind of this use leave different marks, wear marks in the stone that can be later used to identify the stone tool used by the macaques. So it's we are using the behavior that we saw the monkey doing and then identifying the wear marks and then trying to use these wear marks to identify the material in the archaeological context. So we did that for the macaques. We did some excavations to identify this material, and we could then identify the material, more recent material, not so old like the chimpanzees. But it was possible to use those wear marks that we identified we knew the macaques were producing in the stones to identify the material in the archaeological context. So that's one of the main examples of the primate archaeology join the behavior analysis of the macaques and the archaeological method. Now I'm going to talk about the captions. That's my main work and one of the most fruitful collaborations of primatologists and archaeologists. So caption monkeys, just a quick reminder about the taxonomy, because sometimes we are going to find this still Sebus apella as the tufted caption monkeys, but recently, or not so recently, it was the Sebus apella was divided in several species with a new genus, Sapajus. So most of the work with the caption monkeys are done with Sapajus libidinosus and Sapajus xanthosternus in the semi-arid of Brazil, in the Caatinga and savanna areas of Brazil. So, that was just to show what the caption primate archaeology, what were the aims of the primate archaeology. It was to understand the behavior and how the stone tools were produced, and localize the sites with possible accumulation of the material, and then excavation of those sites, and to try to identify the old stone tools by the capture monkeys to rebuild the behavior of the past that we saw in the present too. So just a quick reminder that so percussive lithic tools in capturing monkeys, it's a very common behavior in capturings from savanna and caatinga, Cerrado and Caatinga, that's the Brazilian savanna. So we have several reports, each of those points in the map. It's a report of the groups of capturing monkeys using stones to crack open nuts or other seeds, depending on the resource available in the area. So it's a very widespread behavior. But we have some places that we have this behavior is more well studied, and we have a more diversity of the to use, both stone to use and other kind of stone, other kind of tools. As Edu said, the Parque Nacional Serra da Capivara is one of the main sites for this kind of studies. We are studying there for several years now. It's a place where we have all the human occupation evidence, and you have also the most, so far, the most interesting capturing monkey population that use lithic tools and probe tools for a lot of exploitation of resources. So Serra da Capivara is in the Caatinga, so it's a very dry region during most part of the year. Yeah, not doing those images that were in the last week, that was still very wet. But it's comprised of valleys where the monkeys live, and they are being studied for almost 15 years now. And those monkeys in Serra da Capivara, they use stones mostly for cracking open cashew nuts and grão de galo seed, jatobá fruit, and maniçoba seed. So that's a very common behavior for these captains in the area. They use the stones to obtain this resource. And the first one that we tagged for trying to understand and to work in the primate archaeology context was the cashew nut cracking. Cashew nuts are present in the region for at least 7,000 years. We have evidence that cashew nut was present in that area of the Serra da Capivara. And it is native to Brazil, this food, this tree. And the captains, they eat the whole fruit. They eat the apple of the cashew, that's actually the pseudo fruit. And they also eat the nut, that's the fruit of the cashew nut. And it is the most, for some groups, it's the resource that they use stones. They mostly use stones to access. Even there's one group that half of the stone to use is for cashew nut cracking. And because we are studying this for 12 years, now we have a very good understanding of what kind of stone they use, the weight that they choose to process the food. And this is just an example. That's a normal behavior. The monkey are going to pick up the cashew nut and then transport for an anvil that can be the tree itself, and use a stone to crack and get access to the kernel. Yeah, that's a green cashew nut, and they they consume both the dry cashew and the green cashew nut. So, as I said, they process all the stages of cashew nuts. It's different from other populations that we know that just process one of the stages, like the dry cashew nut with stones. And they have an active choice of the tool, so they don't just pick any tool for any stone to use as tools. They pick up different sizes for different cashew nuts. So they are going to choose larger stones for process the green cashew nuts and smaller stones to the dry cashew nut. And one of the advantages to work with living primates is that we can do experiments too. And so we did some experiments to see how was the choice of the stones. If it was the size, the different materials, what was the factors that they were choosing for processing cashew nuts. And together with the naturalistic work that was done with those captions, we have a very good understanding and how they use the stone tools now. But we wanted to look for old sites of those capture monkeys, and we did look for the sites using the cashew trees as a cue for places where to look for those accumulation of stone tools. And we have the stone tools we use for cashew nuts. They usually leave a lot of residue in the stone when they are using to process these cashew nuts. So we use these cues to identify several sites with accumulation of cashew nuts, cashew trees, and stone tools. And we did some mapping, trying to map the distribution of the stone tool, the lithic material, both the used and not used by the capture monkeys. And we identified some places with accumulation. And after identifying these areas, we did the excavations and trying to collect all the material that was have signs of use by the capture monkeys, and also doing datings of the charcoal present in the excavations. Well, we mostly did the major site was the Cashew BPF2 that we did 2 expeditions in 2014 and 2015. And I'm going to stop here because that's going to be Tom's talk after mine. He's going to present the results of these excavations. But that was not the only thing that was interesting about the capture monkeys. They have another behavior that's not related to food, or maybe it's related to food or a supplementary or to acquire supplementation of minerals, we don't know. That is the stone-on-stone behavior. It's the pulverization of pebbles embedded in conglomerates that the captions in Serra da Capivara do. So far, as we know, there is no other population that does this behavior outside Serra da Capivara. But they do that with a certain frequency in Serra da Capivara, so the behavior is this. It's easier to show. So the captions, they are going to use a hammer, and then they're going to pound in the stones embedded in the conglomerate. And sometimes they are trying to dislodge the stone to get something behind the stone, but in other half of the case, they are just trying to pulverize the pebbles, and they are going to lick, anoint themselves, or sniff the dust produced by the the pulverization, and this behavior is strange because we don't understand why they do that. And apparently, there is no mineral that they could be using for that, but we are trying to look in other hypotheses, like something for anointing the fur or for parasitic infection, trying to something to combat some endoparasites or ectoparasites. But the thing is that this behavior that the monkeys are doing sometimes can produce fractures in the stones. So You can see this is a juvenile, and he's leaking there the dust that he produced. And this stone that he's using at some point is going to break, and we collect this picture on the right. It's the stone that this monkey was using, and that break in several parts. So that for our primatologists, we are not at first interested in the fragments of the stones, but when we show that to the archaeologists, they were very interested in the fractures, in the pieces of stones that broke from these behaviors. Some of those fragments are flakes. It can be described as flakes. They have all the characteristics as flakes. They are not very common, so it's not a great production of those flakes. But the monkeys, something that everybody is going to ask, the monkeys don't use the flakes. We never saw the monkeys use the flakes, the cutting edge of the flake. So they're just interested so far in the dust or trying to dislodge the stones, like this guy's trying to dislodge that large pebble. Mm-hmm. So that's a juvenile. Juveniles sometimes do very stupid things, but you can see that he's leaking the place. So, and this is one of the cases that the stone is going to break. So that was an interesting thing that we were pursuing, still trying to collect more information. So that's the same place that that monkey was using. It was this place here, and we collected this material in excavation in 2015, and we did an excavation. We collect all the material there, including those materials shown here. Some of them we could refit in the whole piece, and that is it was published in Nature in 2016. That we show that that some of the material can be described as flakes. And that's also something that was new, because so far up to this point, flakes were considered something that we need to intentionally produce. You need to intentionally want to produce that, and we show that a behavior that has nothing to do with the flakes can produce some things that it's a flake. More than that, some of the passive elements have several points of impact and several fractures, and if this is loose in the soil, it's going to resemble as a hammer used by a very battered hammer. So just that's part of the work with the stone tools that we have for the capturing monkeys. But in Serra da Capivara, they also use some stones for digging. They can use stones for food, for roots and tubers, spiders. And we're still trying to beginning to understand how this other material can leave marks in the wear marks in those new materials. So this is one of the behaviors that we're still going to study in the primate archaeology context. So this is a monkey digging for spiders. They can use the stone to lose the soil, but sometimes the soil is clean of stones, but some of the places that they dig can be full of stones, and you can have a lot of wear marks in those kind of stones too. Initially we thought those stones didn't produce a lot of marks, but apparently we are rethinking that now. And finally, mostly we are focused in the stone tools, because it's most interesting tools for comparing to the human evolution of stone tools. But the primates, non-human primates, they also use other kind of tools like probe tools. And that's something that the study of non-human primates can contribute, because probe tools is a perishable material, so it's not usually preserved in the archaeological record. So we're studying the probe tools in the non-human primates. We can try to understand how the use of probes happen in the other lineages. So using the capuchins or the chimpanzees as models. So as example, so in the capuchins in Serra da Capivara, they use these probe tools to flushing out prey from hiding places. So they hunt for lizards, scorpions, carpenter bees. And they can also use the probes for dip for honey, wasp or bee honey, and sometimes to threaten snakes. So, and that's a very interesting behavior, because it's the only tool that the monkeys, the capturing monkeys, really produce. They not only use the stone, the tool, but they fabricate this kind of tools. This is an example of a guy trying to flush out a lizard. And that's and this behavior, we're still trying to understand what are the factors that lead this population. We also only know Serra da Capivara capuchins to habitually use this kind of probe tools, and only the males use the stone tools. So we have a lot to understand the factors involved in the maintaining and how is the development of this kind of probe to use. This is just another example. In this one, I just want to show that they really make the tool and transport the tool. So that guy was using one tool, and then he went to a place 3 or 4 meters away, and he's making another tool. So that's really interesting, because usually for the stone tools, capturing monkeys, they don't modify the tools. But for the probe tools, it's something that they fabricate the tool, they leave the tool the right size that they want. It's a very conservative size and they can modify the size if they need. And in this case, well, I have time, so I'm going to leave the video. This one, he was not looking for a lizard. And you can see that it's a behavior that got a lot of attention from young ones. And now he got it. You need to. So what he's trying to pick up from the nest is a scorpion. You can see it's in his hand now. So that's just to show some examples of the study of tool use by the non-human primates. And using the primate archaeology, we can verify or try to identify those behaviors in the archaeological sites. So understanding extending the time depth of the behavior to see for how long this behavior is happening in some place in that place. So we could use the archaeology methods in conjoint with the primatologist methods, and using these several species and several groups that have sometimes 40 million years of separation of evolutionary history. Separated evolutionary history, we can compare those different species that has a similar behavior. So to understand the factors that lead each one of those groups to use the similar kind of material or as tools. And we studying the non-human primates, we can see the behavior happen now. So we can compare these populations and the factors that's happening now and or in the early past, and we can also have the opportunity to do experiments and to try to test some of the factors involved in this tool use and this behavior, and trying to complement with the archaeologist method and trying to better understand the evolution of the tool use, both lithic tool use and other kinds of tools. So that's it. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions.
So now we have some time for questions, and I was told you guys should introduce yourselves when you make a question, so the audience can know where you come from.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Joanna. I'm from the linguistics department. I have a question. All the stones that are broken by the monkeys produce flakes, or just a percentage of it?
No, it's not. It's a very small percentage of the stones of the breaks that produce the flakes. It's just a small percentage of the breakage that produce flakes. Most of the broke stones are just fragments that's not resembles the flakes at all.
Joanna.
Santiago from University of Pará, state of Pará. A little bit because my English is very bad. I'm trying to be understood. Okay, it's possible to notice different types of or different types of patterns in the material remains and in these products related to different inside groups of capuchins, or all these products are the same?
So, are you asking if the different material, the different?
Yes, as you can observe in Catharine groups in Africa, because you can see different types of material related to different groups inside the same species.
We have both cases. We have some of the differences are. Some of the difference could be because of different materials present in the area, or some different resource exploited by the monkeys. But you have some, in some cases, they have the same material, the same resource, and they have different kinds of use of the stone. I don't understand if this is really.
If you can see little marks in these products that could be used to different groups inside the species.
Okay. So we don't have yet the data to show if there is different, very subtle difference between the groups. We still don't have that. We have some difference in the behavior, some behaviors that happens in one group and not happen in another. But we don't have yet the difference, the subtle difference that we were asking about, the very small details in the stones. Maybe there is, but we don't have data yet to say that there is or that is not.
Astolfo Araújo from the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Tiago, I would like to know about the pounding of the rocks and the leaking, etc. Because do you intend to collect samples to see? Because that pebbles are just quartz, no? Perhaps the lichens, I don't know.
So yeah, that's one of the mysteries we're still trying to understand. We did collect the samples of the quartz, of the dust that they produce, and I think we tested 3 times now, and all the time it's just quartz. There is no, it's just silica. There's nothing there, and unless if silica can have any other nutritional value, that so far there is none. There is no literature supporting that.
Yeah.
The other hypotheses that we have are from the silica being used for control of ectoparasites or endoparasites. We are now trying to understand what kind of parasites they have. We are collecting poop for the captains now to identify the parasites that they have. And the other hypothesis was the lichens. That's something that we already thought about. But we never test. We need to test for the lichens and some stones. But we have just a few of the stones that they use have lichens. A great part of the stones that they are doing this behavior don't have any lichen. So I like the lichen hypothesis that I proposed in one of my papers. But I don't think it's going to hold.
Okay.
And then could be another thing that we don't know yet.
Yeah, because
but there's really something that some of the groups do that behavior a lot, and you could see by the videos that they really leak that and they ingest that powder. So it should have some value for them. Or
yeah, I was thinking about like when we flake, when we flame nap, some stones have a distinctive smell. And like my colleague Bruce Bradley, like we keep sniffing it because it's nice, no?
Ah, you do that?
Yeah.
Wow.
We sniff.
Yeah, no.
Because like the smell is I don't know, it's interesting, but So if everything fails, if you don't see any reason, like could be just as the taste and the smell of it.
Yeah, no, the taste, at least for me, there is no taste. I tried that, but the smell when you hit the stone, just after you hit that, there is a
distinctive smell of stone being flaked.
Yes, could be that. We need to check if there is they really go quickly and just after hitting the stone, they are going to smell. But sometimes they also rub themselves in the dust. Could be something for the fur. So there's it could be multiple things also. There could be several things that it's just pleasant for them. So it could be something for a monkey like that.
Yeah, very interesting.
But the fact is that they do this behavior a lot.
It is also true that they go back to the same stones. So they don't just choose a new stone every single time. Different individuals will go back to the same stone. So if the stone has percussive damage on it, they'll reuse it and reuse it and reuse it until it gets completely battered. So it may be the smell. We did think that. But I think it's something to do with creating the dust, because if they go to a stone with very little damage, it takes a long time to start to create the dust.
Yeah, and some of the elements that we identified, they are heavily damaged, so they are going back to that same place for years. So we are trying to to see if there is some specific kind of stones that they like or something. We're still beginning to study that.
I'm going to ask about, my name, I'm Mercedes Okumura. I'm going to ask you about the behavior of throwing stones when females are in the estrus, right? To call attention of potential partners. Do we know know if these stones are any different from the other stones they are using to break nuts and things like that?
Yes, I skipped that slide, but I can actually show I have the video here. So let me show. Você pode voltar aqui a apresentação, por favor? Só pegar aqui, because then so people can understand what we are talking about. Where is it? Cadê? Ai, não coloquei aqui. Cadê? So the behavior Mercedes was talking about is this behavior here. That's the stone throwing, when the female try to get the male's attention, throwing objects into. That's a behavior that it's part of the sexual display of the female when she's trying to get the male's attention. You can see that the male is not paying attention to her. And this behavior is something that's just happened so far in one group of the captains in Serra da Capivara. And we have several females that do that. More than half of the females in this group, when they are in asters, they throw stones at the males. So they have a size that they use. Usually are small pebbles that they use, but it's the same quartz pebbles that we have in the region. Very rarely they throw sandstones, but sometimes I had some case of sandstones being thrown, but usually are small pebbles. Yeah, you can see usually something that fits in the hand, in one hand of the captain, so it's something like 50 grams or 100 grams stone. But there is apparently no difference in the material, it's just in the size. There is several differences in the size that the stones that they choose for each resource. So when they are processing and try to crack the small seeds, they're going to use very small pebbles, but for jatoba seeds and for the stone-on-stone behavior, they usually use larger stones, like 300 grams, even half-kilo stones.
May I ask another question?
Yeah.
Quick one. So, regardless of the differences that they are using different sizes of stones to process different foods, can you see any difference in terms of, because these monkeys, they do have some sexual dimorphism, right? Yeah, so can you see any difference, like in terms of the relation of body mass and sexual dimorphism and the size of the tools?
Yes, there is a small difference in the size. So the males are larger, so they usually tend to use a heavier and larger stone tools. For Serra da Capivara, because they process not so very hard resources, there is no such a difference. So it's very small, and I just have a significant difference for the stone-on-stone behavior, that the males usually use more. They do the behavior more with the larger stones. But in populations where the monkeys crack high resistant nuts, very large palm nuts, so you have a very distinct difference between males and females when they are trying to crack the high resistant nuts. That the males are going to use much larger stones than the females, because then it's a matter of size. They can lift the larger stones, but not in Serra da Capivara. So this is related to the resistance of the resource they are trying to process.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm not acquainted with the definition of stone using, but is this stone throwing a regular kind of stone use, or is this?
Yes, it's a stone. It's a two-use too, because they are using the females is using an object to alter the position or the state of another monkey. So by our broad definition of two-use, it's a two-use. And it's one of the only two-use that's not related to food. Most of the tools that the monkeys and any other primates uses are usually to acquire food. And this is one of the exceptions that they use. And they use a tool to communication. It's a communication tool they're using to.
But it intends a modification anyway.
Yeah, the modification of the state of the other monkey.
Good morning. I'm Ícaro. I would like to understand what is kind to make a comparison, between two or more species, because you say about tools for intentional and non-intentional behavior. Is there some difference between two intentional or non-intentional?
Oh, what I said, that's unintentional. It was the flake production, because the monkeys are using the stone-on-stone behavior to produce the powder, and the flakes are unintentional byproduct of that behavior. I think that was what I mean. I don't. Is that what you're asking? Você quer perguntar em português? Talvez seja.
No. I would like to understand about this kind, because I would like to understand the method you used in your research, because I imagine there is a different kind between a species. For example, you can use these tools to make comparison between species macaque and chimpanzee, and you can use also for hominin species, and there is. You could use this stud to make inference production tools, human tools.
Okay, so I think I understand now. So we usually don't try to infer the intention of the monkey, but we can say that they are trying to get food. So we can say that they're using some of the stones to acquire food or something like that. Yeah, at some point you can even say that they are intending the intention of the monkeys is to get food. But we usually try not to use the intention. We try to forget about the intention, just trying to see the goal of the monkey, and then we saw them using a stone tool to crack open a food, so they're trying to get food. So we say that stone was used to acquire food. So we saw that, so it was something that we saw. So we try to describe that as a process operationally. Well, yeah, but in the end I think we do get we put some intention in the monkeys trying when they are using the stone tools, and in the other case when they are not using the flakes, we say it was an unintentional byproduct by the stone. But I think we can compare with the other monkeys. We use the same methods to study the other monkeys, and even for the hominins in the archaeological record, you actually don't know the intention of those materials, why that was product, why that was made. You're just inferring some intention in that material too. So I think for me it's most like the same. We're just inferring the intention.
Thanks.
It's just the stone-on-stone behavior is predominantly made by the males, is it?
Yes, I have a bias for males in that behavior, but females also do that.
Okay,
but it's
so
it's more males.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe, and that could be something like I said because of the size of the males, because they use larger stones usually to produce that behavior. But we do have some, like the juvenile and females doing that also.
Fine.
Okay, thank you, Thiago, and then we are moving on. So now I have the pleasure to have here Thomas Profit from the Institute of Archaeology, from University College London, who will talk to us about what is primate archaeology and how it can be useful for understanding hominin stone tool use.
So I have to first apologize because my Portuguese is incredibly bad, so I will speak in English. I'm very sorry. And then I would like to thank Edu for organizing this, and for everybody for being here. My training is as an archaeologist, so I did my PhD in East Africa on early hominin lithic material. And very recently, I've been given the opportunity to look at some of these primate tools. And so my aim, although I enjoy watching the behavior, and everyone enjoys watching videos of monkeys doing things, my interest is in looking at the stone tools and then trying to understand early hominin technology. So this talk will mostly focus on three case studies. Dealing with each non-human tool-using primate, so with the chimpanzees, with macaques, and with capuchins from Brazil. And if anybody has any questions about the behavior, I may have to defer to my primatology colleagues, but I can try and answer some of the questions about if they have any behavioral questions afterwards. So as a field, primate archaeology is relatively recent. I think it was kind of initially, as has been discussed earlier, initially kind of properly identified in 2002 with Julio Mercader's excavation of the chimpanzee assemblages in Panda 100. And a number of people, not a huge number of people, but a number of people are now actively working on primate tool use. So I hope some of the case studies that I'm going to show, it just kind of shows the breadth of what primate archaeology can hopefully do, or hopefully tell us, both about primates and also possibly about hominins as well. So the first case study that I will look at is with the chimpanzees, and this is a study that we did recently looking at the Panda 100 lithic assemblage from the Thai forest in the Ivory Coast in West Africa. The second will be looking at long-tail macaque nut-cracking stone tools, and this is a new behavior that was identified by colleagues of mine, Lydia Luntz and colleagues, a few years ago. And then the third will be with the Capuchins, again from Sierra de Capivara, and looking at some of the excavations that were undertaken by Tiago and Michael Haslam back in 2014 and 15 when the Primark project was in Oxford, and I was very lucky to be involved in that in the very last year of that project. So I'll be talking a little bit about the stone tools, or at least the nut-cracking stone tools from that excavation. So the first part of this will be looking at the Panda 100, the chimpanzee excavations conducted in 2002 or published in 2002, and I'll talk about the work we've done and then how they might help us in understanding early hominin technology in East Africa. Most of you will know, and Tiago has mentioned it, the chimpanzees use tools in general, in the widest variety of different behaviors. But unfortunately, they only really use stone tools for nut cracking. It's only quite a limited number of behaviors for stone tool use. There are two groups. You have the chimpanzees in Bossou in Guinea, in West Africa, and then you have the chimpanzee groups in the Thai forest in the Ivory Coast. And it is the ones in the Thai forest which I'm going to talk about specifically. And so this is where the Thai forest is. The site itself is called Panda 100, largely because it is located around a panda oleosa tree, which is a tree that produces these panda nuts. We'll talk a little bit about the panda nuts in a minute, but this is a modern site. This is a direct behavioral location. So Christoph Bosch and colleagues observed chimpanzees nut cracking at this site between 75 and 96. And then in and around 96, the site was abandoned when the tree died. I think it fell over. And then it was chosen because of the known behavior. It was chosen to be excavated 5 years later, in order to test whether or not archaeological techniques could be applied to primate behavior, known primate behavior, and see whether or not it's possible to recover primate lithic material using archaeological techniques. So the panda nut was the main target of the nut cracking at this site. It's one of the hardest nuts on the planet. It requires around 12 kilonewtons to crack open. You can only crack it open with a tool. There's no way you can bite through this or chew through this or break it open with your hands. And because it's such a hard nut, chimpanzees need to use really big hammerstones, really quite large hammerstones. So I'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of a chimpanzee nut cracking site. So first you have the nuts. This is the main target of the behavior. Secondly, you have the anvils, so that the passive element, the object that the nuts are placed on and then struck. And in Thai, most of these, the vast majority of these, are wooden. They're organic passive elements. So they are tree roots, living tree roots. And often, due to use, they develop this quite heavy damage patterns. And so these are both very clearly visible as you're going through the forest, but also if they're covered, if they're excavated, you can identify these as long as the preservation is good. The second part of the anatomy of a Thai nut cracking site is are the hammerstones and the nuts themselves. So the nuts are often found in conjunction all together. So you have the hammerstones, you have the anvils, and you have the broken nuts. The hammerstones themselves are quite large. This is a laterite, I think. But these are big hammerstones. They weigh anything between 3 to 15 kilos. Some weigh up to 20 kilos. The chimpanzees will use both hands to crack open, use these tools. Sometimes they use both hands and a foot, and they'll hold the nut with one foot, and then they'll use 3 limbs to move this hammerstone. So they're big, heavy hammerstones. They often develop quite significant percussive damage, so they have quite clear crushing, and also in some cases you get really quite big pits, and these are the size of a cricket ball, so like a tennis ball size pits on these hammerstones. And this is purely because the raw material there is not, it's quite friable, it's not particularly homogeneous, and it will start to develop these centrally located pits. You do also get occasions where these hammerstones will break in two, and occasionally they'll be moved. So they'll be transported between panda nut locations if they're still heavy enough, if they're still big enough to be used. Once they become less than 3 kilos, they start to be a bit useless as hammerstones. So this is an example of a hammerstone that was refitted, and these two pieces of stone had both been used subsequently after them being broken. They both have, on the other side, they both have small pits on the other side, so they've started to be used again. But these were found about 30 meters away from each other, and the panda trees are located quite sparsely in the forest. So a chimpanzee, presumably a chimpanzee, had broken this hammerstone, or this hammerstone had broken, and then half of it had been moved subsequently to another location and used there as well. So, a little bit about the site. This paper has been mentioned a couple of times now. This is, I would say, probably one of the the earliest kind of primate archaeology papers. It was published in 2002 by Julio Mercader and Christoph Bosch and Melissa Panga, and it was a way to test archaeological techniques applied to primate behavioral locations in order to recover primate stone tools. It's for a first excavation of a primate site, it's a huge excavation. It's about 59 square meters. It was located, the trench was placed around known anvil sites. So these heavy percussive damaged tree roots, it was located around that. So there are most of these anvils, so anvil 1, anvil 4, anvil 5, and anvil 6 were all visible from the surface. And then during excavation, they also found 3 and 2, these 2 smaller ones, and these were old tree roots that used to be on the surface and had subsequently been covered over by sediment. During the excavation, as any archaeological excavation, everything was mapped, and in this case it was hand mapped, hand plotted, and drawn onto gridded maps. There was just under 480 lithic artifacts, or lithic pieces. I'm not sure what to call them, artifacts or not, but lithic pieces of stone were uncovered from the excavation itself. And the original report, although was fantastic in terms of kind of showcasing primate archaeology as a possibly new discipline, it also garnered a little bit of or a degree of contention, because they identified a number of items or a number of pieces of stone in that assemblage that they argued to be flakes, and they termed them flakes. And then they compared them to older one assemblages from East Africa, namely Omo, and they compared them in terms of both density of material and also in terms of metrics, in terms of sizes. And at the time, Omo was seen, the older one assemblage at Omo was seen as being relatively crude. There was a lot of battered material, a lot of angular pieces, and they argued that, or they suggested anyway, that this Panda 100 assemblage, this chimpanzee assemblage, could be a similar kind of type of assemblage to this older one material. Following, in 2004, anyway, the Omo material was reanalyzed. It was looked at again, and it was seen actually, instead of being this crude kind of percussive angular fragment assemblage, it was actually quite a sophisticated napping assemblage. So the older one hominins working stone at Omo unfortunately had access to very poor quality raw material. So the quartzite cobbles in the area, or pebbles, were very small. They had very small chert pebbles in the area. But what they were doing with those is maximizing the number of flakes that were coming from them. So looking at it typologically, it looks like lots of very small fragments, lots of small angular debris. But actually, when you start looking at it technologically, you start looking at the reduction sequences, there's a very clear understanding of conchoidal fracture, and there's a clear effort to maximize the number of flakes from very small raw materials. And so it was argued In this paper by De La Torre and colleagues, it was argued that actually it's similar to comparing apples and oranges. If you compare the Homo material to the chimpanzee material, they're two completely separate things. One is a percussive behavior for cracking open nuts, and one is very clearly an intentional flaking behavior. And so it was argued or suggested that actually this it's not worth comparing these two types of assemblages, or not fruitful in comparing these two types of assemblages. So we got access to the Panda 100 material in collaboration with Julio and Christoph, and we wanted to look at whether or not this assemblage, because it's a big assemblage in primate archaeology and in chimpanzee studies as well, in primatology, whether or not this assemblage is still relevant in any way to understanding hominin technology. And this was brought about because since the Panda 100 assemblage had been published, there'd been a renewed focus on hominin percussive behavior. So people like Adrian and like Ignacio de la Torre and various colleagues had been working on or had worked on percussive behaviors in early hominin sites in East Africa, in Olduvai, and in Kenya, in Turkana. And we wanted to see whether or not this chimpanzee assemblages could give us any insights into the types of behaviors that these hominins might have been doing. It's also true to say that the Lumequi material, at least the published Lumequi material, shows a high degree of percussive activity as well as flaking. So this is potentially a behavior that is being undertaken by hominins right from the very beginning of our understanding of stone flaking, or stone tool use. And so we conducted a full technological analysis and a refit analysis, which took an inordinate amount of time, and also a use-where analysis as well. And we combined these into some simple GIS. I'm not a particularly fantastic person when it comes to GIS and to spatial mapping, but we did some simple GIS on the refit assemblage as well. And so we were missing only 8 pieces, and I think this is probably due to pieces going missing in storage since 2002. So the assemblage is made up of, what we analyzed is made up of around 470 pieces. It's made up of 4 different raw materials. So there is quartzite in the Thai forest. It's very, very rare. We have diorite, laterite, and then the vast majority of the assemblage, something along the lines of 85% of the assemblage, is granitoid, which is this incredibly non-homogeneous, really friable raw material. Most of the assemblage is this. We had bags of this material. This is what we would call small debris and angular chunks. And when we saw this, we had laid it out on the table, and we were incredibly disappointed by, especially coming from somebody who's studying hand axes and lovely East African cores. This material is very unpleasant. Anyway, it's worth noting, and I was initially thinking that this is all going to be all natural. This is just stones that they've just collected. But in the initial excavations from the site, they put in a number of test trenches around in the landscape in order to test whether or not this material showed up elsewhere around the location. And it seems to be that this material only shows up in and around these anvil sites. And so it would suggest that this is debris caused by either the percussive behavior, the hammerstones fragmenting, or an in situ kind of weathering of these hammerstones over time. There are other pieces, a smaller percentage of the assemblage, which can be associated with what we would see in the hominin record as kind of percussive artifacts. So we have pieces that are morphometically very similar to edge pieces and corner pieces from anvils that we would see in East Africa. And these are from hammerstones, and this is not particularly surprising. These hammerstones are big, angular blocks, very similar to the types of anvils that you see in Olduvai, for instance. And so the fact that these hammerstones break in similar patterns or similar ways in some instances, in a very small percentage of instances, is not massively unsurprising. There are 2 examples of what you would maybe classify as kind of a wedge-initiated flake. So these are kind of forceful fractures that have a similar morphology to kind of hammerstone flakes. So when you're napping and you're using a hammerstone, sometimes you'll get the hammerstone will fracture in a way that looks like a flake. And then there is the one example, as opposed to the nearly 20 from the first publication, there is one example of what we could classify maybe as a flake, as a conchoidal flake. And this is on diorite. This is on a material that is far more homogeneous and is, anyway, I mean, you'd have to see this piece to kind of form your own opinions, but to my eyes, this is the only piece that looks, or in any way looks like, what we would classify normally in the archaeological assemblage as a flake. Very interestingly, though, there are no, in the whole assemblage, there are no complete hammerstones. So all of the assemblage is made up of fragments of hammerstones and fragments of this behavior. And this is probably due to the fact that once the tree died, it stopped being useful for the chimpanzees. But because raw material in the Thai forest is so rare, the chimpanzees reuse hammerstones. They will move hammerstones away from a dead tree to a new tree. And so in the 5 years since the tree died, between the tree dying and the excavation, the chimpanzees had managed to move as many of the hammerstones, the complete hammerstones, or the large fragments that were still usable, away from this nutcracking site. And so what we have here, I think, is a percussive behavioral location, so a location where the chimpanzees are doing this behavior, that is only represented in the archaeological record by angular chunks and by small fragments, and there are no formal tools, there are no complete tools that you would normally identify as being associated with this type of behavior. The use-where analysis we did was only on a very small percentage of the assemblages, or the assemblage, and this was mainly because we only looked at the pieces that we could clearly see that there was some sort of percussive damage. The damage is mainly characterized by single impact points. There's crushing of the grains around these impact points, and then on occasions there are these kind of V-shaped notches along the edge. We were able to kind of update the original publication a little bit. This piece, this illustrated piece here is from the original publication, and this was argued to be a pitted hammerstone. And so if you bear in mind that these hammerstones are between 3 and 20 kilos, this piece is about 6 centimeters across, so it's this big. And so we looked at this piece. This is the same piece under the microscope, and we looked at the undamaged, the kind of undamaged cortical areas of this piece, and then what was suggested to be the pits. And actually, there's no difference. There's no damage at all on this piece. This piece is associated with percussive behavior. It is a corner fragment, and it's also a refit. But it is not a hammerstone. So we could update at least some of the classifications from the original paper and say that this is not a hammerstone, but it is a fragment of a hammerstone. There is some raw material variation. So, for instance, the diorite is the most homogeneous, and this is probably the reason why we have this one instance of something that looks half decent. You have laterite, and in some cases, these laterite cobbles will break. This is still, to my mind, a little bit too small to be a hammerstone. I have primatology colleagues. My colleague Lydia Luntz thinks that it could have been used by a juvenile, which is fine. But there's very little, this material with the use-where analysis, it doesn't show up any percussive damage at all. With the refit analysis, the original paper identified 7 refit sets, which was about 16 artifacts, and this represented a maximum movement of about 1.6 meters, and only identified at two of the 6 anvils that were located in the excavation. So our analysis, and this is one of the examples from the original, this is that hammerstone, and you can see there's a fracture at the base. Our analysis showed that we took a long time. It was a really laborious effort trying to refit this material because it's very unpleasant. It's not like normal refits where you can work on the basis that things have a dorsal and ventral surface, and no, these are just, it's like a brute force approach of trying every piece against every other piece. But we managed to increase the number of refits to 16 sets, and this is 35, so it's just under 10% of the assemblage. And from that, we can start to see possible fragmentation patterns of the hammerstones. So we have one example of a split cobble. And in fact, I'm not sure if you can see it, but in the third image here, there's a little gap, and that is where one of the purported flakes also fit. It's not a flake, it's just a chunk that has come from this split cobble. But we have some more extensive refits, and these have percussive damage on them. And this is a type of fragmentation that we see on the more angular sides of the hammerstones, and this is kind of these small, non-invasive pieces that have detached and cause this kind of rounding of the edge of the hammerstone. And then the second type of fragmentation pattern are these, it's a little bit more invasive detachments of kind of corner pieces and edge pieces, which will eventually significantly kind of reduce the volume of the hammerstone. And these don't happen, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. These also happen one after the other or at the same time. So we can start to see with the refit analysis that there are certain, I mean, of course, there's no intention here. The chimpanzees are not trying to break the hammerstones. It's just this is the way that they seem to be breaking from the refit analysis. From the refits as well, we can also, again, update the original publication in that this was classified as a flake. This was probably classified as possibly the nicest flake from the assemblage. This is an edge piece. This is not a flake. It is a fully cortical chunk of stone. It is associated, it does have damage on it. It is associated with percussive behavior, but it is not a flake. It has a similar morphology, maybe, but it's not a flake. We were fortunate, and Julio did allow us to use the original hand-drawn maps, which plotted each individual artifact. So it is possible to use these maps, which we digitized and put into ArcGIS, to plot the refits onto these maps as well. And so it gives us a little bit of insight into as you can with archaeological refits, insights of movements of objects within an archaeological excavation or within a site. And so just under half of the refits came from neighboring meter squares. So that's a movement of between 1 to 2 meters. And this is normally, you can see here, is normally in and around anvil locations. And so these darker areas this is a tree, if anybody can tell. The darker areas are used tree roots, used anvils. And there is fragmentation in and around these areas. We also found 3 instances of longer transportation distance of hammerstones. So we have one of about 9.5 meters, and then 2 of between 16 and 17 meters. And so I think currently this is although it's not a huge distance, it's here to over there. This is the longest individual transport events of a chimpanzee, or of an ape, or a primate, a non-human primate, in an archaeological site. I mean, you can observe chimpanzees moving things 30 meters, and that's fine. But it's never been shown that you can do this using archaeological techniques, and using archaeological techniques that you use for understanding hominin movements of artifacts. So in terms of some conclusions of this study, for those of us who are kind of becoming or are interested or becoming interested in primate archaeology, I think it has some interesting points. Firstly, in the past there have been experimental studies in Bosu, for instance, where hammerstones are placed and the chimpanzees can use them, and then those hammerstones are mapped, and the movement of those hammerstones are mapped. But that is you have to be there. That's a behavioral study. You have to watch it. What we can do, or what has been shown you can do with these refits and with looking at the archaeological material, is that you can do this when the apes and the chimpanzees are not there, either when they're not there now, or they are a group that no longer exists, but you know that there was some sort of tool use. It might be possible to understand this type of finer grain movement of tools in and around these locations by these individuals. It might also be possible, and I hope the third case study, I think I'll talk about this a bit more, but it might also be possible using these types of techniques and applying not necessarily our understanding of intentional napping, but of percussive behaviors to these assemblages to trace kind of diachronic variation over time. If you excavate enough and excavate with a large enough time depth, applying archaeological techniques to understanding stone tools or lithic analysis to this behavior, might give us some sort of information about variation of this behavior over time. Fortunately, at this site, it is just one behavior, and in fact, at the 4,500-year-old site Nulu, which is not far away from this location, it is also only one behavior. It's just nut cracking. There's very little variation. So for hominins, for understanding or for suggesting hominins, you have to be very careful because you can't just place a chimpanzee behavior and just say, this is what hominins did, because they are entirely different species. But you can, I think, start to use primate behaviors and start to understand primate behaviors to maybe draw hypotheses, testable hypotheses that you can then apply to the archaeological record. And one of the things that we have done in the past is look at how these hammerstones change shape and size and how much they are used in relation to how far away they are from the raw material source. And we can see that in chimpanzees, and the same as what people have suggested for hominins, is that the further away from the raw material source you get, the smaller the tools are, and they are more heavily used. What we can maybe suggest, or what we find sometimes in older hominin sites, is that when transport distance of raw materials are published or discussed, it's usually from raw material source to final resting place, and it's normally quite a large distance. But what we see with the chimpanzees is actually, it is quite a large distance in terms of a chimpanzee, but it's made up of lots of little small jumps. So both at an intrasite level between anvils, so maybe 10, 15, 20 meters between anvils, but then also moving away the hammerstones from that site to trees 30, 40, 50 meters away. Eventually, over time, you'll start to get what you'd see in the hominin record as a start point and an end point, but it's made up of lots of little jumps of these materials. You may also be able to draw or start speaking about hypotheses about what we might expect prior to 3.3, prior to the emergence of stone flaking, where there is a hypothesis by McGrew and colleagues, Bill McGrew and colleagues, where it argues that the stone flaking may have emerged from some sort of percussive behavior, like nut cracking, for instance, where accidental flakes are produced and then they're in the environment, and then the hominins had access to these types of flakes. From the Panda 100 assemblage, we can see that actually flake production on this raw material is very poor, is very, very, very small, very infrequent. And so we can suggest is that if this theory is to hold water, then it has to take into account that the raw material has to be of a good quality. The raw material in the area has to be of good quality. And that quality and morphology of that material would have played quite a significant part in the production of accidental flakes. It also allows us to start to think about what we might be wanting to look for if we are looking for this type of percussive behavior in the hominin archaeological record. We might want to, instead of looking for formal tools, hammerstones or anvils or passive elements, we might want to start looking for incredibly ugly angular chunks, which would normally just be completely overlooked. It is possible to identify them, but you have to spend a lot of time and really look at them in detail. Okay, so the second, I'll try and be quick with these ones now. The second case study is now looking purely at primate behavior. And this is to do with the long-tail macaques in Thailand. And these are, this is a behavior that has been only relatively recently identified. So as Tiago mentioned, these macaques also use stone tools for, again, a wider variety of different behaviors than chimpanzees. They crack open oysters. They crack open gastropods, so seashells and snails. They crack open sea almonds, which is a nut, right? It's a coastal nut, a coastal fruit. And now we also know that they also do nut cracking. And the first three are in the intertidal zone on these islands, and the nut cracking is more inland. It happens on this island. This is Yao Noi Island in Phang Nga National Park in Thailand. And this was published a couple of years ago by a colleague of ours, Lydia Luntz. And this is largely kind of a macaque response to a human behavior. So on this island, about 10 years ago, 11 years ago or so now, people started planting palm trees for harvesting oil palm. So they cleared the forest and they started planting these trees, realized that I don't know what happened. They stopped working there. 10 years or so, they stopped working there. But what's happened is the macaques have now moved in. So there's this very large population of palm trees producing all of these palm oil nuts, and the macaques have moved in and have started using it, started doing this behavior. So technically it's a new behavior for the macaques. It's the same motions as the other behaviors, but they're applying it to a new type of food. These macaques are not habituated, so any observation of the behavior has to be done remotely with camera traps. But there are abundant hammerstones in the area. There's a lot of stones across the whole landscape, and the anvils themselves are these huge kind of undulating, non-movable blocks of limestone. There are some more transportable ones, but the vast majority look like this. They're these big blocks. So let's see if we can. This is the behavior. That's the good thing about primate archaeology or primate behaviors is there's lots of videos where we can't show videos of hominins. So you can see it's a very controlled behavior. They place the nut with one hand. They use one hand with the hammerstone. So as nutcrackers, they are pretty skilled. So they're very good at this behavior. What it means is that we have another behavior that we can kind of apply, say, archaeological techniques to. And actually, what's interesting, and what we're thinking about doing, or what we're hoping to do, is what's interesting is that because it's a new behavior, there is a possibility that if we excavate one of these sites, we can get the entire from before the behavior happened all the way up until the behavior is happening now. So it'd be interesting to see, what happens there. But as part of this, I was tasked with looking at the hammerstones, which are initially not particularly pretty objects. Again, we have complete hammerstones with these flake removals, and these are not napped hammerstones. They're not conchoidal flakes. They are just flake fragments. And then we have hammerstones with these kind of these fracture angles, or with these angular detachments. What's interesting is there's a huge amount of percussive damage, and a large amount of battering. So in the archaeological assemblages in East Africa, and for Olduvai, for instance, you have pieces like this, and Adrian has worked on this material. And these are hammerstones with fracture angles, and they're not napping hammerstones. They're some sort of hammerstone used for some other activity, some sort of other percussive activity. And with the macaques, we get, although not as extensive in any way to the Olduvai material, we get pieces that have these or have similar types of heavy percussive damage. And this is nothing to do with interaction between the hammerstone and the nut. This is all to do with them missing the oil palm nut and them hitting the anvil itself. We also have mainly two types of use wear. So we have on the high areas of the hammerstone, the morphologically high points of the hammerstone, you have a large amount of crushing, a large amount of battering, and then in the concave areas where the nut is mainly impacted, you have polishing and striations, and this is quite interesting because it allows us to compare them to other macaque tools. What's interesting about the macaques, at least what's interesting about these macaques anyway, is that the tools that are used for different behaviors show different types of damage. So the tools that are used for processing oysters or cracking open oysters are usually very small, and they have usually a kind of a pointed or a pointed surface, which is heavily battered. And so they use them it's called an axe hammer, isn't it? It's been called an axe hammer. Anyway, they use them to kind of batter the oysters. Whereas if you compare them to gastropod processing, what you get are much larger, flatter cobbles with pits, and they're using the flat surface basically crush open the gastropods. And so this, both metrically, you can distinguish between the different behaviors, but also visually they're very different. And so on the left you have the gastropods with the pits, you have sea almonds, which don't have a huge amount of kind of mechanical percussive damage, but they do have a lot of residue. Oysters are these much smaller tools, and then with the oil palm nuts you have quite distinct percussive damage as well. And so it is possible, at least on this island and this group of macaques, and it may be different elsewhere, because one of the things with macaques is they're on lots of different islands, and we see lots of different behaviors on these different islands. But at least with these ones, you can identify the different behaviors just from the stone tools themselves. So the damage caused by, instead of caused by the gastropods, which is interaction with the food itself, the damage caused by the oil palm processing is due to interaction with the anvil. It's due to missing the anvil, missing the nut itself. Okay, and so my final case study, and so one of the main things why I put this case study, the macaque case study actually is that we can start to understand the behavior, or at least understand the artifacts associated with the behavior, even if you can't directly observe or be anywhere near the monkeys. You can still use the archaeological record that they leave to try and start to understand a little bit about this. And one of the things we're hoping to do is also, now that the monkeys crack oil palm nuts, we can start to directly compare those to capuchins, because they also crack the same type of nut, and also to chimpanzees. So we can start to look at varying skill levels between species, all using the same raw materials and the same target nut as well. Okay, and so finally I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that was done by Tiago and Michael Haslam when they were in Oxford. And I was tasked with looking at the lithics when I came in. And it's taken me a long time. So this is, I think, the material from this is now currently in press, so should be released in the next week or so, I think. I hope. So as we've been through, so capuchins, I'll run through these quickly. Capuchins do a huge number of tool use behaviors: nut cracking, seed processing, we have the stone-on-stone percussion. And what Tiago and Michael did was as Tiago has mentioned earlier, is look for cashew trees in and around Sierra de Capivara. This is the Pedro Ferrado group, so they go around looking for the cashew trees, mapping the density of cashew nut cracking tools on the surface, and then putting in small test trenches in order to see if they can trace back this type of capuchin behavior, looking to see whether it's possible to trace it back into the past. And it was published a few years ago, I think, as a news and views in Current Anthropology. I think it was a small paper explaining that this site yielded cashew tools at about 700 BP. So this is the site. This is Kaju BPF2. So this site had a large number of capuchin tools on the surface, a huge number of capuchin tools on the surface. And then, as I wasn't involved in the excavation, but as I understand it, as the excavation continued, they could identify new capuchin tools. It's about 70, at its deepest, is about 70 centimeters deep. And we can separate it based on dating of very small charcoal fragments in the sediment. We can separate it into 4 different chronological phases now. And so the earliest phase is phase 4 at the bottom here, and now this is between 3,000 and 2,400 BP. And so there are cashew, or there are capuchin percussive tools at around 3,000 years ago. This is a 4-time increase of the previously published number, and it represents about 450 generations of capuchin tool use, at least in the area. This is one of the earlier, or the more recent levels. This is very large, or large-ish anvils, which have very clear and very characteristic capuchin percussive damage. They also have cashew residue on them. And then when we look at the lithic assemblage itself, we can see that it's made up of anvils and anvil fragments. These are just large passive elements, large percussive elements. Mostly the assemblage is made up of capuchin hammerstones and broken hammerstones of various types. There are one or two pieces that might be classified as fragments or flakes or angular chunks, but the vast majority of the assemblage is to do with hammerstones. The raw material used by the capuchins mimics the raw material in the area. The vast majority of these quartzite cobbles that are eroding out from the conglomerate. We have a couple of sandstone blocks, which capuchins seem to always want to use as anvils, because they're these nice flat stones. And the capuchin tools themselves are significantly larger than the natural mean dimensions of stones in the area. And so you can, they're selecting stones that are bigger than the average in the background material. So in the earliest phases, we have a number of heavily damaged hammerstones. We have this material, which is either, these have percussive impacts on them, and these are either flake detachments due to percussive damage, or they are entirely naturally occurring fragments. These are not conchoidal flakes, these are not napped, these are just hammerstone fragments, hammerstone flake detachments. The earliest hammerstones do have a higher degree of percussive damage in terms of numbers of impacts. So we can see in phase 4 and phase 3, you have examples where there are more than 20, more than 40 individual impacts, whereas in phase 1, which is cashew processing, you have far fewer. The hammerstones also in the earlier phases are significantly lighter and smaller than those as in the first 2 phases, so in the more recent phases. So these are examples. They're typical capuchin-sized hammerstones. They have individual impact points. I'm not sure if you can see on the one at the top, they're individual impacts, or areas of percussive damage. In phase 3, it's a strange group of artifacts. So they have it's similar to phase 4 in terms of the level of percussive damage on the hammerstones, but it's also similar in terms of phase 2 in terms of the frequency of anvils. Phase 3, I don't know why I put that one in. Phase 2, the hammerstones are significantly larger than in any other phase. So we have much bigger hammerstones in phase 2 compared to phase 1. And they are much larger than in phase 4 as well. And so these, in phase 2, these are some examples of anvils. So we have a sandstone anvil in the middle, we have a quartzite anvil on the side, and some anvil fragments as well. Phase 1, every hammerstone has cashew residue on it. This is it's very typical of capuchin tool use. This is kind of like a brown oil that comes from the cashew nuts that basically paints the whole of the cashew hammer. They lack percussive damage, and this is probably because these capuchins are using the wooden anvils. They're using the tree as a wooden anvil, and so there's very little interaction with stone anvils, and there's very little interaction with conglomerate or sediment. So what can we do with a primate or a capuchin site that is, possibly 3,000 years old? And we can maybe do the same things we do with human sites, as we can look at variation over time in terms of tool use. And we know that capuchins, from experimental work and from behavioral observations, we know that capuchins vary the weight of their hammerstones based on the hardness of what they're hitting. Okay, so if they're hitting stone for the stone-on-stone behavior, their hammerstones are heavy, they're big. If they're hitting seeds, for instance, or they're processing soft fruit, the hammerstones are usually much smaller or much lighter. And so what we find is that there's a high frequency, an increased degree of percussive damage in hammerstones in the very earliest or very oldest phases compared to the younger phases, which might suggest that there is some sort of change in not the percussive behavior, they're still doing the same behavior, but maybe a change in what they are processing, maybe a change in what they're using this behavior on over time. So hammerstones in phase 4, the smaller, much lighter hammerstones, may be associated with a low resistance food processing. And the increased damage in phase 4 may be associated with mishits onto a hard substrate, or if it's a small food, then there'll be an increased number of mishits using a small food. So this is an example of manihot seed processing. This is an example of a capuchin using a small hammerstone to process a very small. In fact, I probably should have put sound on this. Every time he impacts that seed, he also impacts the stone. And so the hammerstone is obviously bigger than the seed, but the seed is still quite small, and the stone itself impacts the hammerstone. So that hammerstone would produce, or would be, when it's left, when it's found again, would have a relatively high degree of percussive damage. And so this is an example of, we've seen now a number of videos. This is cashew processing on a tree root. I think we have one more, and this is cashew processing on a tree branch itself. And you can see the hammerstone is bigger. He has to use 2 hands, whereas with the seed processing it's 1 hand. And that you would get very little percussive damage on this type of behavior because they're using it against an anvil that is much softer. So as always, I come back to the hominin record because that's my training. Is you see with the human record, with the early human record, there are these very large diachronic changes in technology. So for instance, you have the older one to the Acheulean transition in East Africa, and this is associated with a new species or cognitive developments or new niche adaptations by different species or new species. You also have diachronic and synchronic variations within the older one as a technocomplex on its own. And this could be associated with regional adaptations to the local environment, raw material availability, possibly varying cultural groups or traditions. And then you also have variation within a single tool use or a single tool type within the older one. So this is variation of hammerstones. So you have pitted hammerstones, you have hammerstones with fracture angles, you have napping hammerstones. And so what we might have, or what there possibly is a similar type of variation, which we can identify in the human record. We might also be able to identify it in the capuchin record as well, or in the primate record over time. And so why could there be this type of variation at this site in Sierra de Capivara? So it could be, and this was mostly forced on us by reviewers, it could be cultural variation mediated by social learning, although this is very difficult to test for, It could be long-term site reoccupation by either a single or multiple capuchin groups undergoing tool use change due to changing environments. It could represent, and this is probably what it is, it probably represents a changing local flora environment in the area. So maybe at one point, or more recently, there are cashew trees, but in the past there may have been other types of food available in this location. But what it does need is maybe more work and a larger sample, and definitely a different or additional sites in order to test whether this is actually happening across the landscape. So I think, in conclusion, I think primate archaeology, I also have to say this because I am now being paid to do primate archaeology, is very interesting, and I think it's an interesting meeting of both archaeology and primatology. But I think it also can allow us to kind of build hypotheses using the primate behaviors, build hypotheses in order to then be tested in the archaeological record, in the hominin archaeological record, and try and understand hominin tool use, looking at these different species. Purely for primatology reasons, it's very interesting because it allows us to look at primate behavior when these animals aren't there, when they're non-habituated, when you can't observe the behavior. It allows us at least to be able to draw some sort of inferences in the same way that archaeology does with early hominin excavations, draw inferences about behavior when you can't physically observe the creatures. And it allows us possibly in the future to develop, in the similar way you can with human archaeological work, past cultural sequences for different primate groups. It's happened for chimpanzees. It's now possibly happened for capuchins, and it's only a matter of time before somebody braves excavating in an intertidal zone in Thailand and excavating in between high and low tide in order to get a longer term cultural sequence for macaques as well. So I think I'll leave it there. If anybody has any questions, I will be, well, I will try and answer them.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just point here to be recorded. What elements could classify sites that you present here in Africa, in my part of Africa, that you could classify it as a non-human site, archaeological site, instead of a human archaeological site?
I don't know. It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
Sorry, because you can see this in the case of Capuchin, it's very interesting, but I didn't observe it in West Africa archaeological site. It's very interesting.
I mean, in all of the archaeological sites in East Africa, it's hominin. There's no monkey, there's no chimpanzees. It's all flaking, it's all flint napping, or not flint napping, but it's all napping behaviors. What I think is interesting is in maybe looking at sites, looking at the time period you're starting now to get sites in East Africa, like the Lomekwi, for instance, where you are getting a combination of percussive behavior and also flaking behavior, but there's still flaking, whereas in chimpanzee nutcracking and in various things like that, you don't get this type of, even with the very earliest archaeological sites, you don't get the same records. So maybe it's possible, but you would have to really be looking for it, and possibly on much older sediments than is what is currently being looked at.
Hi, my name is Leticia. I am PhD candidate at the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. So I have a question. You showed a figure about the Caju site, that we can observe the hammers and the face. They are all separated with different colors.
Yes.
And we can observe also the stratigraphy.
This one?
What?
This one? Oh no.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Not that one.
No, sorry. It's on my screen. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So my question is, all that layers are separated, or
No. No. These are arbitrary layers based on the dating. So there are gaps in the dating.
Yeah.
But these are no. As far as I'm aware, Tiago will be able to answer this better. I wasn't there when the excavations were happening. But as far as I'm aware, I mean, if you've seen the excavations in Sierra Capivara, it's very homogeneous sediment. So these separations are based on the dating, and you have quite big gaps between phases. So several hundred years between phases.
Okay, and it's possible to see if they were reusing hammers, or they bring new hammers.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it's possible to. I've no idea. I mean, these are monkeys, and they may well have been doing it, but I think there was a degree of sediment covering the hammerstones in the lowest level, as opposed to the hammerstones in phase 3 or phase 2. But no, it's entirely possible that they might have been.
Yeah, maybe
reusing.
refitting pieces.
Well, I've tried. Oh, okay. There are no refits. It's unfortunately, and it's mostly hammerstones, and it's mostly complete hammerstones. So no, it's very difficult.
Thank you.
Well, I think this all is very interesting because archaeologist also. So I think it's really amazing to have these big differences between the rocks and inside 4 different strata. Like probably if you run statistics, you have more variation in this site than we have at Lagoa Santa site in central Brazil that is pretty much homogeneous during the whole Holocene. So it's really interesting. But I was going to ask if somebody considered doing some kind of experiment and leaving very good raw materials for the chimpanzees to use as hammerstones and see what happens, because the raw materials you mentioned are really
not good.
No good for flaking. So perhaps using leaving the very good fine quality basalt and see if perhaps the flakes would detach or something like this,
yes.
or even flint.
This is something that we're doing currently.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
And we're doing it with the capuchins and with the macaques, and also with the chimpanzees.
Okay, but good raw material to see if it flakes. Perfect.
Yeah, and so we don't have results with that yet, but.
It's more of a technical question. So you described the cashew residue in the phase 1 hammerstones. Is there any chronological limits for testing this? Like, have you tried to test this for phase 2 and then it failed? Or?
So we know that there's cashew residue because you can see it. In phase 1, you can see it on every hammerstone. On phase 2, you see it on no hammerstones. It has been done. There has been tests done to test for cashew residue, but I don't think it.
Just for phase 1 and some of phase 2, but after phase 2 there is nothing. You couldn't identify that. Well, we did the testing for the residue, so we were able to identify for phase 1 some of the phase 2, the top of phase 2. But not on phase 3 or 4. So we tried to test, but nothing could.
And it could be to do with preservation. It could be to do with the fact that cashew residue just doesn't preserve over 600-700 years, or 3,000 years, or whatever. But I mean, in phase 1, all of this material is very clearly just caked in it.
What do you think about? I have the impression that to acknowledge, especially after you make these experiments using good raw materials that can detach flakes and stuff like this, but even the instances where you have intentional flaking, this is something that was always in my mind when I was a student. Like, we always have this kind of idea of a unilinear thing. And so when we see flakes, we always put them as some Homo ancestor or some Australopithecine that has to do with us. And so it's more of a philosophical thing. I think that this kind of study, and after the results, like this opens a new venue, an avenue of thinking, because it's very possible that even the intention of flaking some of the Oldovan or stuff like this can be related not to our species, but to other species that went extinct. So I think this is interesting because opens other possibilities. Not that we will be sure one day, but it's good to think that everything is branching, and the stone tool use can be a branching thing also. So we can find the earliest stone to use in the world, and to discover that it went into a dead branch, and that guys simply disappeared. And then you have another instance of stone to use that goes to another dead branch, and then you have a third one that goes to us, something like this. Not to mention that stuff can be invented and forgotten, and invented again and forgotten. Something like in the Thai forest where you work in, I read the paper about the communication from Bush is the author. well, for those who are not familiar, very quickly, that they had a chimpanzee group that the alpha male, is it, if I'm not wrong, the alpha male was always behind, and he signalized, he vocalized it, he used vocal signals, and also beating into tree trunks, giving instructions about the direction of movement. And then there was this alpha male and 8 or 6 other males that were like lower rank, but were responsible for the small groups. So it was a large chimpanzee group that walked in smaller groups going after food and stuff. And then most of the males were killed by poachers. And then this behavior disappeared. So there is a lot as all evolutionary reasoning has to take into consideration that we have a lot of dead ends and things that are forgotten because of chance or population decline or several things. So I think this opens a different line, a new line of reasoning that is more evolutive, actually, because it's less unilinear, and perhaps we can see instances where flakes are not being made by our ancestors at all.
I think also it's with the capuchins and with the stone-on-stone behavior that Tiago spoke about. What's interesting, I think, there is, I mean, it's interesting that the monkeys do a behavior where they hit these stones together and then they accidentally make flakes. But it's also interesting to think about that for a long time, the production of flakes has been intentional, and it has been associated with Homo, no longer in Homo, but at least with hominins. And what these monkeys can show us is that flakes can be produced entirely non-intentionally for a behavior that is not associated with cutting or with wanting to use those flakes by a species with, compared to a hominin, a tiny brain, and a non-bipedal species, so they do walk around on 2 feet, but they are mostly arboreal, with a hand morphology that is far less advanced than the hominin hand morphology. So there's all these things that have been associated with intentional flake production, intentional tool use production, which these monkeys can do, just entirely unintentionally, completely randomly. And so, yeah, I think it's at least interesting to think about what might be possible prior to 3.3 million years ago, or prior to the earliest evidence of flaking.
May I just quickly intrude in your question, Astolfo, because there's this discussion that maybe the Lomecki would be something that was invented and then lost, and then you have a long time without any tools, and then you have the Odo one. So that also talks a lot in terms of the importance of thinking about independent inventions during hominin or primate history.
Independent, and also you can lose the technology totally.
Just one comment to see what you think about it as something I guess came out from a discussion with Bill McGrew, that this amazing discovery of yours that the flaking can be unintentional, it perhaps can shed a different light on the evolution of the flake used by hominins in terms of like a sort of niche construction. If you do percussive tool use and unintentionally produce flakes in the same place for some time, you create an accumulation of unintentional flakes. So it fosters the eventual discovery of the possibilities of flake use. So perhaps we instead of imagining the production of flakes and the earliest blades as something preconceived, it can be just fostered by the accumulation of nice flakes, and then at some time, slightly smarter guy finds the capuchins didn't, but an hominin at some time having plenty of flakes around, it would make it much easier to find out about the potential of these tools.
Yeah, this is the theory that percussive behaviors might lead to flaking. I mean, there's no suggestion that the hominins are hitting stones together and then licking the dust, I don't think, but yeah, absolutely.
Does this make us, allow us to think that stone use development might not be totally subject to cognitive development or brain development?
I don't know. I mean, the capuchins, Tiago will be able to answer this better than me. The capuchins, I think, have the largest brain by body size of any monkey or any other than...
The neocortex ratio.
Yeah.
Body size is close to the chimpanzees.
So the capuchins are particularly bright, particularly clever primates. But I'm not sure. My background is in stone tools and stone tool production, as opposed to kind of cognitive evolution and the evolution of the brain. So I would have to defer to Tiago on that one, I think.
Oh, so then, just to keep it on the record, so the body ratio, the neocortex ratio with body size of the capuchins are close to the chimpanzees and the humans, so they are the largest, the biggest ratio of neocortex size and body size. So there is a correlation with at least with the neocortex size.
Just a comment to your question is that actually evidence of to use is way earlier than increase on the brain. Increase on the brain is later. So we will never know for sure because you only have the casts, the endocasts. You don't know how it worked. But
yeah, but it's still, if you take into account what we can observe in terms of mammals in general, so even Australopithecines, they have a brain size that was greater than would be expected for an animal for that size. So, but that's true. I mean, the really important increase in brain size happens much later in evolution, and by then you have like millions of years where you already have like percussive technology.
Once we put accident in this equation, then brain development does not have the same weight it used to have, no?
I'm not sure. Also because when you have the first important episode of brain increasing in size in hominin evolution, that's also when a bit later on you have more sophisticated stone tools being made. So there's something there. But also remember, these hominins, they left Africa with this very simple toolkit. So tool technology, yeah, it's important, but it's not everything for survival, at least at that time. So it's very confusing, but also very interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And now we have a lunch break, and we'll be back at 2 for the talks of Adrián, Mercedes, and Astolfo.